The rain had just started falling when Daniel Harper pulled his old pickup truck into the parking lot of Harper's Corner Diner. From the outside, the diner looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago when Daniel first opened it. Warm yellow lights glowing through the windows, the faint smell of grilled onions drifting into the night air, and the familiar neon sign flickering gently above the entrance. But tonight felt different. Daniel sat quietly behind the steering wheel for a moment, watching the place he had built from nothing. Most people who walked into Harper's Corner had no idea that the quiet man sitting in that rusty truck was the man who owned not just this diner, but 23 others across the state. To the world, Daniel Harper was a successful restaurant chain owner, but tonight he wasn't here as the boss. Tonight he was just another hungry customer, or at least that's what everyone inside was supposed to believe. Daniel adjusted the worn baseball cap on his head and pulled the collar of his jacket higher. His beard had grown thicker over the past few weeks, and the old jeans he wore looked like they'd been through years of hard labor. The disguise wasn't elaborate, but it was enough. No one in this diner had ever actually met Daniel Harper in person. Most of the staff only knew him through framed photos in the office or the occasional company newsletter. And lately, those newsletters had started coming with troubling reports. Customer complaints, employee disputes, anonymous messages sent directly to the corporate office. At first, Daniel had assumed they were exaggerations, but then the emails kept coming. One message in particular had stuck with him. "You should come see what really happens in your diner when you're not around." The message had been anonymous, but it had been enough to convince Daniel to see the truth for himself. So here he was, going undercover in his own restaurant. Daniel stepped out of the truck and walked toward the diner entrance, the bell above the door ringing softly as he stepped inside. The warmth of the diner wrapped around him instantly. The place looked busy tonight. A few truck drivers sat near the counter eating late dinners, while a young couple shared a milkshake in the corner booth. Behind the counter, waitresses moved quickly between tables, balancing trays of burgers, fries, and steaming coffee mugs. For a moment, Daniel felt proud. This place had been his dream once. But as he walked further inside, something strange caught his attention. Near the back of the diner, two waitresses stood beside the soda machine, whispering quietly. Daniel slid into a booth nearby, close enough to hear their conversation without drawing attention. A young waitress approached him with a menu. She looked tired, but polite. "Evening," she said. "What can I get started for you?" Daniel gave a small smile. "Just a burger and coffee." She nodded and scribbled the order down. "No problem. Be right back." As she walked away, Daniel leaned slightly toward the next booth, pretending to study the menu, while his ears focused on the two waitresses still whispering nearby. At first, their conversation sounded like normal workplace gossip, complaints about long shifts, complaints about customers. But then one of them said something that made Daniel's stomach tighten. "Honestly," the first waitress scoffed, crossing her arms, "I still don't understand how this place stays open." The second waitress laughed. "Because the owner's an idiot." Daniel froze. The first waitress rolled her eyes. "Seriously, whoever this Daniel Harper guy is, he clearly has no idea what's happening in his own diner." The second waitress leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You heard what Rick said, right?" Daniel's grip tightened around the edge of the table. "Rick?" "That was the night manager." "What about him?" the first waitress asked. The second waitress glanced around nervously. Then she whispered something that made Daniel's heart skip a beat. "He says the boss barely checks anything. That means we can do whatever we want." The first waitress smirked. "Like what?" The second waitress nodded toward the kitchen. "Like cutting corners." "Rick's been telling the cooks to use the cheaper meat deliveries. Says nobody can tell the difference." Daniel's stomach dropped.
Cheaper meat? That wasn't just dishonest.
It was dangerous. Harper's Corner had built its reputation on fresh ingredients and quality food. Daniel had spent years making sure every diner followed strict standards. But if what this waitress was saying was true, someone inside his restaurant was deliberately breaking those rules. The first waitress leaned back against the counter. Well, if the boss is too stupid to notice, that's his problem.
Daniel felt a strange chill run down his spine.
The second waitress smirked again. Oh, it gets better. She lowered her voice even more.
Rick says if things keep going like this, he might start skimming from the register too.
The first waitress's eyes widened. You're kidding? No. He says the boss never shows up anyway. Daniel's jaw tightened. The bell above the door rang again as another customer walked in, but Daniel barely noticed. His thoughts were racing now, cutting food quality, stealing money, and worst of all, employees openly mocking the man who had built the entire company. Just then, the young waitress returned to his table with his coffee. She placed the mug down gently. Your burger will be ready soon, she said. Daniel nodded quietly. But before she could walk away, a loud voice suddenly echoed from the kitchen doorway. It was Rick, the night manager. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a greasy apron and an irritated expression. Hey! Rick shouted toward the waitresses. What are you two standing around for? The two waitresses quickly straightened up. Sorry, Rick, one of them muttered. Rick shook his head.
Unbelievable, he grumbled. This place would fall apart if I wasn't here running things.
Daniel watched silently from his booth. Then Rick said something that made Daniel's blood run cold. Rick pointed toward the dining area. And if the boss ever actually bothered to show up here, he'd realize I'm the only reason this diner still works. The two waitresses laughed, and Daniel slowly lowered his coffee mug back onto the table. Because in that moment, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just gossip. Something far bigger was happening inside his diner. And Rick might not be the only one involved. But Daniel had no idea yet just how deep the problem really went.
Just then, the kitchen door suddenly swung open again.
One of the cooks stepped out, pale and shaking. Rick, the cook said nervously. There's something you need to see in the freezer.
Rick frowned.
What now?
The cook hesitated.
Then he whispered something that made Rick's face turn completely white. And from his booth across the diner,
Daniel Harper watched it all happen.
Because whatever was inside that freezer, it had just changed everything.
The kitchen door swung open again with a loud metallic thud.
The young cook stood there, pale and breathing heavily, his apron dusted with flour. His eyes darted nervously between Rick and the rest of the staff standing near the counter. Rick, you need to come to the freezer, he said quietly. Rick frowned. What's so important that you can't handle it yourself? The cook hesitated, lowering his voice even more. I think something's wrong with the new delivery.
Rick's expression tightened for just a second before he forced a casual shrug.
Relax, he muttered. It's probably nothing. But Daniel Harper noticed something the others didn't. Rick's hands were shaking. Rick quickly wiped his palms on his apron and walked toward the kitchen, pushing past the cook. Fine, he snapped. Show me. The kitchen door closed behind them. From his booth, Daniel stared down at his coffee, his thoughts racing. New delivery? That didn't make sense. Harper's Corner only received meat deliveries from one supplier, a company Daniel had personally vetted years ago. Every shipment was inspected and documented. There were strict rules Daniel had spent decades building. Yet everything he'd overheard tonight suggested those rules weren't being followed anymore. And if Rick was cutting corners with food quality, what else was he hiding? A few minutes passed, then 10.
The kitchen door remained closed.
The waitresses resumed their work, carrying plates to tables and refilling drinks as if nothing unusual had happened. But Daniel noticed the same two waitresses whispering again near the soda machine. One of them looked nervous now. "Did you see Rick's face?" she murmured. "Yeah," the other replied. "He looked like he'd seen a ghost." Daniel leaned slightly closer, pretending to scroll through his phone. "What do you think it is?" the first waitress asked. The second waitress shrugged. "Probably another cheap delivery." Then she lowered her voice.
"You know Rick's been ordering from that new supplier, right?"
The first waitress blinked. "I thought the company had strict rules about suppliers." "They do," the second waitress whispered.
"But Rick says the boss never checks anything."
Daniel's chest tightened.
New supplier? That was impossible.
No one was allowed to change suppliers without corporate approval, which meant one thing. Rick had been doing it secretly. The kitchen door suddenly burst open.
Rick stormed out, his face flushed and furious. "Everyone back to work!" he barked. The entire diner went silent for a moment.
Rick ran a hand through his hair, clearly trying to regain control. "Just a minor issue with the shipment," he said loudly. "Nothing for you idiots to worry about." But Daniel noticed something else. Rick avoided looking toward the dining area. Almost as if he didn't want customers paying attention, the young cook who had called Rick earlier stood behind him, still looking uneasy. Rick turned sharply toward him. "Get back in the kitchen," Rick snapped. "Yes, sir," the cook said quickly, disappearing behind the door again. Rick sighed and leaned against the counter. One of the waitresses walked over carefully. "So, everything okay?" Rick glanced around the diner before answering. "Yeah," he muttered, "just some packaging issues." Then he lowered his voice.
"And keep your mouth shut about it."
The waitress frowned slightly.
"About what?" Rick's eyes hardened.
"Exactly." Daniel slowly took a sip of his coffee, hiding his expression. Something was very wrong here, and Rick clearly didn't want anyone asking questions. Just then, Daniel's burger arrived. The same young waitress set the plate down in front of him. "Here you go," she said softly. Daniel nodded.
But as he looked down at the burger, something immediately caught his attention.
The meat looked different, darker, thinner, greasier than usual. Daniel had personally trained chefs across his diners to use a specific beef blend. He knew exactly what it should look like. And this wasn't it. Daniel cut the burger in half with his knife. The smell hit him instantly. Something wasn't right. This wasn't the premium beef Harper's Corner was known for. This was cheap, very cheap, and possibly worse. Daniel felt anger slowly rising in his chest, but before he could take another bite, something strange happened. The young cook from earlier rushed out of the kitchen again. He looked even more nervous now. He walked quickly toward Rick, whispering urgently. Daniel couldn't hear every word, but he caught a few. "Inspection?"
"Tomorrow morning."
Rick's head snapped up.
"What?" he hissed.
The cook nodded. "They just called the office. Someone reported us." Rick's face turned pale.
"Who?" "I don't know."
Rick glanced nervously toward the dining room.
For a brief second, his eyes passed over Daniel.
Daniel quickly looked down at his plate. Rick leaned closer to the cook. "Listen carefully," Rick whispered. "Go back there and throw out every box from that delivery." The cook looked shocked. "But Rick, that's hundreds of pounds of meat." "I don't care," Rick snapped quietly.
"Dump it before anyone sees it."
Daniel's pulse quickened.
"Throw it out?
Why would Rick destroy the shipment unless he was trying to hide something? The cook swallowed nervously.
But what if...
Rick grabbed his arm.
No questions.
Then Rick whispered something so quietly that Daniel almost missed it. If the health inspectors see that meat, we're finished. Daniel slowly set his fork down. Health inspectors, illegal meat deliveries, secret suppliers. This was much bigger than he thought. But before Daniel could decide what to do next, the bell above the diner door suddenly rang again. 3 people walked inside, 2 men and 1 woman. They weren't dressed like customers. They wore dark jackets and carried clipboards. The entire diner seemed to go quiet as they stepped inside. Rick noticed them instantly, and the color drained from his face, because standing at the front of the diner, looking directly toward the kitchen, was a woman holding a badge. She spoke clearly. "Good evening. We're here for a surprise inspection." Rick's hands began to tremble, and from his booth across the room, Daniel Harper slowly leaned back into his seat.
Because if the inspectors went into that freezer,
they were about to discover something Rick had clearly tried to hide. Something serious enough to destroy the entire diner. But Daniel still didn't know the most shocking truth yet. Because at that exact moment,
one of the inspectors suddenly turned toward Daniel's table
and stared at him closely, almost as if she recognized him.
Who is really behind the illegal deliveries inside Harper's Corner Diner? Is Rick acting alone, or is someone bigger pulling the strings? Should Daniel reveal himself now, or stay undercover and uncover the full truth? Comment below.
Follow for part 2, because what Daniel discovers next could destroy his entire diner chain.